Hello again. Right now we'll be looking at Riding the Iron Rooster by Paul Theroux. Not as much context on this one, but you'll still need some additional space to write your notes. So if you can begin by reading the text. So it's an extract from the travelogue by the American travel writer and novelist Paul Theroux. He took 8 trains across Europe, Eastern Europe, the USSR, and Mongolia on his way to reaching the Chinese border. But this section of this text is specifically about Paris, so you don't need to worry too much about that. So if you just want to pause and read through. Right, so we'll start with the purpose then. So it was written in 1988. It's a travel book, so it has that function, to expose people to travel in particular areas. And the text as a whole is about China, but this little section is about Paris. So we're going to say that the purpose here is to kind of explore the truth behind Paris. Now, one of his aims has famously been to disprove the Chinese maxim, "You can always fool a foreigner." In other words, you can be blindsided when you see these new places. You can see them, in a different light because you're not actually a citizen there. You can be blinded by the lights. So we'll look at that more when we look at Paris. But it's very clear that he's trying to basically say it's not true. You cannot fool me. So yep, inform and entertain readers of his very underwhelming experience in Paris. It's clear that he's not enjoyed himself. Again, to air his frustrations with Paris. He also writes in a way to sway the reader in a particular direction. It's quite persuasive at times. He's not really looking at the other side of Paris as such. It's literally kind of one-sided, isn't it? It's not this stereotype of Paris being, the city of love across the world, all very romanticized. And he's really leaving it for the audience to kind of connect the dots. But I think it's pretty clear that, he's not enjoying himself there. Audience then, so fans of Paul Theroux, in case you were wondering, he's the father of Louis Theroux. I'm not sure if you know him, but the famous documentary maker. Those who are interested in an honest interpretation of travel, Paul Theroux was known for, not lying as such. He gave his honest opinion, no airs or graces. So those who are interested in that type of travel, people who are looking into travelling specifically to Paris with this extract, and those with an interest in the collapse of the USSR and its influence. As a text as a whole, you'd need to know more about that, but for our extract, we're not too concerned about this. Okay, mode, so text type. Just like Sea in Sardinia, it is a travel log. More modern, 1988, as opposed to the earlier Sea in Sardinia. But just a travelogue as a whole, just what that is, just to make that very clear. Essentially, its purpose is to show a particular area and their own personal impression of it. So it's not like an article which might be trying to very specifically persuade you to go and, hire a particular hotel in a particular city. This is all a lot more personal. It's his feelings and impressions of the place. So that's why you can see it's like quite personal language. So topicality, so what's actually happening. So it starts off with him exploring his underwhelming and disappointing arrival to Paris. It's very clear from the start he's not loving it. He then discusses the bleak and depressing architecture, all the buildings, and he does that through making references to the Irish novelist and playwright Samuel Beckett, but we'll look at him later. And then by the end of the text, he's concluded that he is disappointed. He challenges this stereotype of gay Paris, and how, it's not somewhere that he's enjoying the experience of. And then finally, context for this, not as much as Sea in Sardinia, but the Iron Rooster, just so you know what that is, it's one of the many trains that he went on when he was doing his long journey to China. So it's just a train. It's the title, obviously, of this travelogue. Paul Theroux, more specifically, as I've said before, but he's an American travel writer and novelist, well known within the travel writing genre. So people are very aware of who he is. It was written in 1988 at the time where the collapse of the USSR was happening. But again, we can look at that further later. But for this particular section on Paris, we don't need to delve too much into that. And just for when we get to the Samuel Beckett section, Samuel Beckett was an Irish novelist, playwright, poet, and short story writer. Really, really famous writer. He lived in Paris, hence the connection, but his work was very well known for being very depressing, dark, not uplifting, kind of quite existential crisis, like, what is the purpose of life? It was quite dark. So that is why he's referencing Samuel Beckett in the middle of the text, because he lived in Paris and he's trying to be like, well, obviously Samuel Beckett's work was depressing if he was surrounded by a place like this. Okay, so about to go through. Not as many quotes on this one as such, but we'll go through and we'll annotate what we can. So, start from the beginning. We came to Paris and were met by a bus and brought to a hotel. Now, I'm going to argue that's quite a passive voice there, the fact that he was met by a bus, brought to a hotel. It almost makes it seem that he's helpless here, that he has no choice. He's been taken to this hotel, almost like, he's been captured. So it's kind of just setting the tone straight away that, he's not enjoying it here. So he's very disappointed. Also, the next line, I haven't highlighted, but where it says near the end of the metro line, you might be familiar with the idiom, or the pun even, both, the end of the line, more or less, death. So again, you could say that's a pun there, is playing on them words, playing on that idiom, with dark humour to show that basically this is not going to be a great trip. It's foreshadowing the disappointment that is about to happen. And yeah, it's like he's at the end of the line. He then starts making comparisons to home for him. Now, he talks about the 14th arrondissement, which is essentially just an area. But what he does, he makes an intercultural reference. That should have come up there, an intercultural reference, which is where you reference other cultures, other personal kind of aspects, just so you can relate to what he's talking about. So obviously, if his reader is an American, he's trying to say, this is what it's like, just so they can make that comparison. So he does embed the French lexis, arrondissement, because that's a common feature of a travel log. But then he does also then get in the proper noun, Chicago and South Boston. It's allowing this comparison to be made to his American audience that is quite bleak. It is nothing special, and yeah, it falls short of being spectacular. It then goes on to talk about the post-war blocks of flats, which you can imagine anyway, that they're grey, they're weathered, they're not meant to be very attractive. And he uses the syntactic parallelism. There were too many of them, and they were too close together. So this is where he launches really into specific critique of the architecture of Paris. Again, sense a bit of an entrapment there. He's surrounded by these tall, depressing reminders of post-war, and that grey is meant to come across as very depressing, a lack of freedom, and yet it's like he's confined in this grey, bleak setting. He then says, and people said, is this Paris? Is this France? Where's the Eiffel Tower? Now, you've got reported speech here. He's kind of adopting, the voice of the other people he was with. So you've got ongoing rhetorical questions. It's like a shared voice. It's not just his opinion that this is depressing. It's basically saying that those he was with shared that view. So it's the collective disappointment and disbelief of everyone. Challenges the stereotypical romanticised image of Paris. So you've got your particular reference there to the Eiffel Tower. It's again just going against all the stereotypes of Paris. They're underwhelmed. This isn't what they thought it was going to be. It then talks about the suburbs. So whilst the centre of Paris is a masterpiece, so you've got some positive imagery there, what he is experiencing is simple and awful. Okay, it's quite blunt. He's making it very clear that, Paris is more than just the centre and it's disappointing. So it offers an insight beyond all the stereotypical images of Paris being the city of love. If we link back to that Chinese maxim, about fooling tourists, he's saying that he isn't being fooled. He sees what Paris really is. And it gets really depressing. So he starts saying how this building, it's got basically pavements and high windows which are encouraging people to kill themselves. So I've said it's taboo, it's quite dark humour that people don't normally say, but it's his voice, it's his tone. He's very cynical of the place, he's basically disgusted by it, and how all elements of this infrastructure lend itself to promote suicide and unhappiness. Because there's such harsh, horrible pavements, the high windows are just there asking for people to kill themselves, which is really, really dark. But again, it's just his extreme way of saying that everything is designed here to be depressing. Right, and now we get to the Samuel Beckett stuff. So we've got the esoteric reference first of all. So this quite obscure reference to a writer that not everyone will be familiar with. So you've got Samuel Beckett. Now, as I've said before in the context, Samuel Beckett is known for very dark, depressing writing. And then you've got him saying, then I was told, funnily enough, that Samuel Beckett lived here. So your parenthesis there, or funnily enough, is a bit of a sarcastic quip that, obviously Samuel Beckett lived here because it's so depressing. It's perfectly suited to such a melancholic, depressing writer. So you've got a bit of sarcasm in there as well. He then goes on and he does kind of give some further context to Samuel Beckett for those maybe reading this that don't know his writing, which is quite good for his audience, about how his stories and plays about the sheer pointlessness and utter misery of human existence. All very depressing, and he's just making his point very clear that Samuel Beckett was probably influenced by his area here. So there is a semantic field of depression. It's again this existential crisis, like what is the purpose of life that Samuel Beckett was known for. And what Theroux is saying is that obviously it's because if he was surrounded by such a horrible setting, of course he's going to have this existential crisis. So you've got you've got Theroux's internal dialogue when he kind of says to himself, I thought, no wonder. So adds to this satirical voice, this approach to dark humour, and how he's projecting his own thoughts about Paris onto other people of the past. So he's basically saying that his experience, is awful. So therefore, Samuel Beckett's experience must have been awful. Okay, just moving on a little bit. So he's talking about going for this morning coffee. He went to this newish spick and span place that resembled the lonely hotels that are found just outside American airports, where people stay because there is nowhere else. So your personification there of hotels and lonely hotels. Again, it's creating a sense of isolation. It's very lifeless. It's unwelcoming. And again, another intercultural reference back to American airports. He's elaborating his view, and the whole idea is no one stays there really out of choice. It's more out of necessity. People stay at an American airport hotel because they need the airport, not out of joy. So he's saying that why would anyone actively choose to live in a place like this? He then has the rhetorical question, Beckett came here for pleasure. And again, what he's really doing there is showing his disbelief. He's shocked that anyone would knowingly choose to spend time in a place like this, let alone live there like Beckett did. So again, he's just bewildered by anyone would choose to do this. But if anyone was going to, it would be Samuel Beckett because his writing was so depressing. Right, quite a nice intertextual reference here. So he's really holding on to this kind of theme of Samuel Beckett, you could say. So he talks about people being in their flats here in Paris, in a grey building in which residents waited for Godot by watching television. Now, Waiting for Godot is one of Beckett's most infamous plays, really, really popular play. Now, all it's about is about these two characters who are sat waiting for a guest called Godot, and the whole play is just them sat there talking about waiting for him, and then the end of the play, he never turns up. So they've wasted all their times waiting for someone that was never going to arrive. So making that more relevant to this is basically saying that people are wasting their lives here, waiting for something to happen, and it never will. So basically it's showing how futile, how pointless, how boring people's lives are here in this area. It's quite harsh, but he uses that nice intertextual reference to back up his whole theme of Samuel Beckett. He then says, and it was 17 stops on the metro from the centre of Paris, the left bank, the museums. So you've got a nice triadic list there, showing the distance, from Paris. It isn't all about the centre. So you've got this romanticised notion that Beckett worked effortlessly in the most romantic city. In other words, when people consider Beckett working in Paris, you think, oh, how romantic. He'd be sat there with a coffee, loving life in, the most romantic city in the world. Instead, what Theroux is saying is that no, he wasn't even near the centre of Paris. He was in this suffocating, desolate suburb area. Okay, moving on then. We've got ellipsis at the start here, so stressing that they've edited this for us for the exam. So there was probably a little bit before this, but even so, it's now the next day. So it was a wet black morning in Paris. So really obviously, we'll start with pathetic fallacy. So again, a depressing atmosphere once more. You'd think a new day, maybe a new outlook on Paris, but no, it hasn't improved at all. You've then got his reference to the street sweepers and milkmen doing their solitary rounds by the light of street lamps. So it's got kind of like military connotations there. It's like they're working against their will, they're being punished. Everything here is a chore. You could link that to the USSR, but we won't go there yet. And basically, yeah, it's just everything is so depressing, so much routine. It's all very dull. We then have him moving away from these suburbs, potentially with a sense of hope, but then that is quickly kind of destroyed, where there were more of these buildings and they were deeper and grimmer. So you've got your comparatives, deeper and grimmer. So the deterioration of Paris's infrastructure, it's like this endless mass of suburbs that are depressing, that are ugly. It's just inescapable. So even when he left these suburbs behind, his experience has not improved. If anything, it is getting progressively worse for him. Okay, so now he's talked about the people he was with. So the windows of the train, they were shocked and disillusioned. It wasn't Gay Paris. So Gay Paris is an idiom, a saying like happy Paris, happy France. And he's basically saying, no, that is not correct. He subverts this stereotype, the expectations of the reader, thinking that, Paris is going to be the best place in the world. They've been misled, and basically saying that himself and those that he was with, they have not been fooled. They have seen it for what it is. Again, linking back to that Chinese maxim about, being fooled when you're a foreigner in another country. Then he starts to elaborate a bit more, kind of like justifying, say America. So he is saying that in America, they put up suburbs really quickly and cheaply, knowing that they're going to do their job, that they're not permanent. So he draws upon these comparisons to American suburbs. It's quite self-deprecating. It's all tongue-in-cheek, though. It's nothing too serious. But saying that, they do put up suburbs very quickly, just so they fulfill a purpose for now. However, as we move on, he talks about how, yes, in America, their buildings aren't perfect, but here, there's this sense of permanence, that they are here forever. So you've got the superlative most, where it says most horrific aspect is that they look as though they will last forever. It's very hyperbolic, dramatic, but basically, unlike the temporary places they put up in America, these ones seem like they're going to last forever, and he is horrified by that. So these buildings aren't going anywhere, it's not going to improve. Unlike his own experiences in America, where, things aren't perfect, but they're not meant to be. Then we end with a nice final reference, final rhetorical question. It'd been the same in Outer London. How could houses so old look so awful? Now, he alludes to a previous entry when he was in London, and how he had the same thoughts there, that, London, the centre, people think it's amazing, but as you get to Outer London, it deteriorates. So he's trying to engage a further audience there, allow them to draw upon their experiences too. But it's nice how in the end he's like, how could houses so old look so awful? So you've got the repetition of intensifiers, so it's really foregrounding how, he's so disappointed, his disbelief. He doesn't understand how something you'd associate with beauty, you know, old history, heritage, etc., could actually, when it comes to it, be really disappointing. So again, brings his whole section together here. He is a travel writer. He's giving his impression very clearly, and how things went from bad to worse, and how you shouldn't just believe what you read elsewhere and think of places just through their stereotypes, like Paris. It's quite a lot there. If we look at the question, very similar to seeing Sardinia one, you'll be looking at how does Theroux create a sense of voice when discussing his journey. I think that's very clear here. Just note that obviously while the whole thing is quite depressing, you want to talk about the shift in voice as it goes on, because things just go from bad to worse. And that's how you can start to evaluate a bit more clearly.